The Galactic Council killed one human, Earth responded with total war. Part 1, The Ambassador's Last Breath. The body hit the floor before I could scream. I was standing 6 meters away when it happened. 6 meters. Close enough to see the light go out of his eyes. Close enough to hear the sound his knees made when they struck the crystalline floor of the Grand Conclave chamber. Close enough to smell the sharp, electric burn that followed the discharge from the Adjudicator Prime's gauntlet. Ambassador Jonas Reyes had been mid-sentence when she did it. He had been saying something about sovereignty. About Earth's right to govern its own colonies in the Outer Arm without interference, without taxation, without the slow, grinding pressure of council oversight that had been squeezing human settlements for the past 11 years. His voice had been calm. Measured. He had practiced that speech for 3 weeks. I had listened to him rehearse it in his quarters on the transit vessel, watched him trim every word, every phrase, until it was clean and honest and impossible to dismiss. The Adjudicator Prime had dismissed it anyway. Her name was Velorith. She was tall, even by Valorian standards, with pale violet skin and 4 narrow eyes arranged in a horizontal line across her face. She had been watching Jonas with the expression a person wears when they are observing something mildly inconvenient, a slow drain, a flickering light. When he paused to take a breath, she raised her right hand, and the gauntlet on her forearm hummed once, and then Jonas Reyes was gone. Not dead immediately. That would have been, in some terrible way, kinder. He fell. He trembled. His hands moved against the floor like he was trying to find something to hold onto, and then they stopped. The whole thing took about 9 seconds. No one in the chamber moved. 41 species were represented in that room. Hundreds of beings from across the known galaxy, sitting in tiered rows of carved stone and bioluminescent paneling, watching the floor where a human man had just been removed from the living world as casually as someone brushing crumbs off a table. The silence was not the silence of shock. It was something worse. It was the silence of familiarity. Like they had seen something like this before, and had learned that the correct response was to look at the floor and wait for it to be over. My name is Yara Osei. I was Earth's cultural attaché on Velketh Station, which meant my job was diplomacy, documentation, and making certain that humanity's presence in the galactic community was treated with respect. I was not a soldier. I had never fired a weapon in my life. I had a recorder clipped to the inside of my collar, because Jonas always insisted on records. He was careful that way. The recorder had caught everything. For a moment I stood completely still, because my body had not yet decided what to do. Velorith was already turning away from the podium, speaking in low tones to one of her aides, and several of the council's administrative staff were moving toward Jonas's body with the unhurried efficiency of people performing a routine task. One of them, a small gray-skinned being I did not recognize, produced a flat silver instrument and began scanning the body. I walked forward. I did not plan to. My legs simply moved. "Stop," I said. The gray-skinned being looked up at me without expression. "That is Ambassador Jonas Reyes," I said. "Citizen of Earth. And you are not going to process him like waste material." Velorith turned her head slowly toward me. Her 4 eyes settled on my face. She looked at me the way someone looks at a piece of furniture that has unexpectedly spoken. "The creature was removed for disrupting council proceedings," she said. Her translator rendered it into flat, perfect English, which somehow made it worse. "Its remains fall under Standard Council Disposal Protocol. You are advised to return to your designated observation area." "His name," I said, "was Jonas Reyes. And I am taking him home." Nobody stopped me. I think they were too surprised that a human was still standing and talking. Or maybe they simply did not believe it mattered. Either way, I called the transit vessel, I had Jonas's body transferred to the medical bay, and then I sat in the communications room for 4 minutes and thought about what I was going to do next. There was only one thing to do. I opened a channel to Earth. Not to any specific office. Not to a ministry or a department. I sent it broad, on the emergency frequency, encrypted with the highest clearance code Jonas had given me at the start of the mission. The message was 14 words. I counted them as I spoke. Ambassador Reyes is gone. The council did it. I have the full recording. Then I leaned back in the chair and looked at the ceiling of the communications room, which was curved and pale blue, and I thought about the fact that we were 11 light-years from Earth, and that the signal would take time to travel, and that somewhere in the Council's administrative logs, Jonas had already been categorized as removed biological material. They had given him less dignity than a footnote. I thought about the recording clipped to my collar. I thought about every word of Jonas's speech, every careful, reasonable, civilized word, and about the 9 seconds that followed. I thought about Veloritha's face when she turned away. The complete absence of concern. The total confidence that what she had done would carry no consequence. That Earth was too small and too new and too far away to matter. I sat with that thought for a long time. Then I checked the transit vessel's departure window and started writing my formal incident report. The Council sent 2 officials to my quarters 2 hours later. They informed me that Ambassador Reyes had violated Council decorum protocols and that the Council would not be entertaining any formal grievance from Earth at this time. They suggested that Earth appoint a new ambassador within 60 standard cycles and that the new ambassador arrive with, and I am using their exact words here, adjusted expectations. I thanked them for their time and closed the door. Then I sat on the edge of my bunk and stared at the recorder in my hand. Velorith had done what she did in front of 41 species, in the most important diplomatic chamber in the known galaxy, and she had expected nothing to follow from it. She had expected Earth to grieve quietly, to send a strongly worded message through official channels, to wait for the Council's response, and then to accept whatever the Council decided to say. She had never dealt with humans before. Not really. She did not know what we become when we lose someone. She did not know the particular quality of human grief, how it does not fold inward and collapse, how it does not scatter into helpless fragments. She had no reference point for what happens when you take something from us and then look us in the eye and tell us it does not matter. I knew Earth would respond. I knew the moment I sent that message that something enormous had just begun. I did not know if it would be enough. I did not know if it would be right. I did not know if Jonas would have wanted it. He had been a diplomat to his core, a man who believed more than anything that conversation could solve what conflict could only delay. But Jonas was gone, and the Council had smiled when they turned away from his body, and I was sitting alone on a station 11 light-years from home with a recording in my hand and 14 words already traveling through the dark at the speed of light. I looked down at the recorder one last time. Then I put it in my pocket and waited for Earth to answer. Part 2: What Earth Does in the Dark. I had assumed I would feel something when the response came. Relief, maybe. Or fear. Or the particular tight feeling in the chest that comes before something irreversible begins. Instead, when Admiral Constance Mercer's face appeared on my screen, calm, precise, her silver hair cut close to her skull, her expression carrying none of the diplomatic softness I was used to seeing in official communications, I felt something closer to recognition. Like watching a door open that had been built years before anyone ever decided to use it. Yara, she said. We have the recording. We have everything. I need you to sit tight and not give them anything else. Understood, I said. Do not answer their questions. Do not engage their officials. Do not let them transfer you, detain you, or move you to a secondary location. You are protected under Galactic Treaty Article 7, which guarantees safe passage for surviving diplomatic staff. Use it. They might not honor it. They will, she said. Not out of principle. Out of habit. They've been doing this long enough that the rules are automatic, even when they don't want them to be. The moment they deviate from their own protocols, they give us more than we already have, she paused. And what we already have is enough. I wanted to ask what was happening on Earth. I wanted to ask how people were responding, whether there was panic, whether there was rage, whether the government had held an emergency session or whether everything was still being processed. I wanted context. I wanted to understand the size of what had been set in motion. I asked none of it. Mercer had a look that communicated, politely but absolutely, that there was no time for any of those questions. 14 hours, she said. Then you'll see something. The channel closed. I spent those 14 hours writing. I wrote the full incident report. I wrote a personal account of everything I had witnessed, every word spoken, every movement made, the smell of the chamber after the discharge, the sound of the administrative staff's footsteps as they approached Jonas's body. I wrote it all down with the care and precision that Jonas had taught me, because good records mattered. They were the difference between a story someone could deny and a record no one could argue with. At hour 11, Velketh Station's internal communications network began broadcasting a council advisory. The advisory was brief. It stated that Earth had transmitted an unauthorized emergency signal from council premises, that the council was reviewing the content of said signal, and that Earth's remaining diplomatic personnel were being requested to surrender their communication devices pending investigation. I read the advisory twice. Then I backed my recordings up to 3 separate encrypted drives, deleted everything from the station's accessible network, and put the drives in the lining of my travel bag. They could have the device. The device was empty. At hour 14, exactly, something happened. Velketh Station's external sensor array went into alert. I found out later, from a station crew member who was considerably more frightened than she let on, that 17 jump signatures had appeared simultaneously at the edge of the station's sensor range. Not one vessel. Not a patrol. 17 signatures, appearing at the same moment, from 17 different approach vectors, like a hand opening its fingers all at once. The station's defensive systems came online. Sirens moved through the lower corridors in low, rhythmic pulses. But no one fired. Because the 17 vessels did not advance. They held position. They settled into a formation that encircled the station's transit lanes with geometric precision, and then they broadcast a single signal on all frequencies. The signal was not a threat. It was not a demand. It was an announcement. Earth fleet vessels have established a security perimeter around Velketh Station in accordance with Article 19 of the Galactic Transit Authority Code, which permits the escort of diplomatic personnel in circumstances of demonstrated risk. Ambassador Yara Osei is to be transferred to Earth vessel Edgar at her request and under her own authority. Council personnel are advised not to interfere with this transfer. That is all. They did not say, and if you interfere, we will do this. They did not say we have more where these came from. They simply stated what they were doing, cited the exact regulation that permitted it, and left Velorith's administration to understand the rest on their own. Which they did. I was transferred to the Edgar within the hour. No one stopped me. 2 Valorian officials watched from the corridor as I walked to the transit bay, and both of them had expressions I had not seen on their faces before. It was not anger. It was something quieter and considerably more unsettling. It was the beginning of doubt. On the Edgar, Captain Nolan Price met me at the docking bay. He was a compact man with dark brown skin and very still eyes, the kind of eyes that had seen a great deal and decided to stop being surprised by any of it. He shook my hand and showed me to a cabin and told me that we were departing in 4 minutes. "What's happening?" I said. "At home." "What's actually happening?" He was quiet for a moment. Not because he didn't know. I could tell from the set of his shoulders that he had been waiting for someone to ask. "Within 6 hours of your transmission," he said, "every major government on Earth held an emergency session. Every single one voted the same way. No dissent. No abstentions." He paused. "Yara, there hasn't been a unanimous vote across all governments since the Lunar Treaty in 2094. People were arguing about tariff schedules last week. But on this, not one voice against." I sat down on the edge of the cabin bunk. "And the fleets? The merchant fleets," he said, and there was something careful in how he said it, "have been reassigned." He let the sentence land. "The research stations in the outer arm have been reclassified. The survey vessels are being recalled." I understood what he was not saying. I had heard rumors over the years, quiet things that circulated in diplomatic circles, never confirmed, always plausible. That the merchant convoys were heavier than cargo required. That the research outposts had infrastructure that no scientific mission strictly needed. That somewhere in the long, patient decades since Earth first joined the galactic community, someone had been thinking about the possibility that the galaxy was not, in the end, a safe place. "How long?" I asked. "We've had 22 hours, he said. "Trade disruptions in the Velith corridor started 4 hours ago. The Council's supply chain for the inner assembly worlds runs through 7 relay points. We've positioned vessels at all 7. We're blockading them. We're exercising our legal right to close transit lanes that pass through Earth-adjacent space," he said, with the exact same careful tone he had used before. The Council wrote those rights into the Transit Authority Code themselves, because they never imagined anyone would use them against Council members. But the code doesn't have exceptions based on who you are. It just has the rules. He looked at me steadily. We are following every rule, he said. We are citing every regulation. We are broadcasting the legal basis for every single action we take. Because when this is over, and it will be over, there is going to be a record of what both sides did. And our record is going to be clean. I thought about Jonas. About how carefully he had written his speech. About the margins of his charter draft, filled with notes in his small, cramped handwriting. He would have liked that, I said. Price nodded once. I know. I read the speech. The one he was giving when he stopped, he was right about most of it. He left me to rest. I did not sleep. Earth was moving in the dark, as it had always moved when it had to, not loudly, not with theater, but with the particular human combination of preparation and patience and complete, absolute commitment. We had not started this. But we had decided, in the space of a single unanimous vote, that we were going to finish it. I lay in the bunk of the Edgar and watched the stars through the cabin viewport and thought about Velorith turning away from Jonas's body with that small, confident smile. I wondered if she was smiling now. I doubted it. Part 3, The Shape of Human War. My name is Kethare. I am the Director of Intelligence for the Valorian Council Authority, and I am going to tell you something that no one in this building will say aloud. We made a mistake. Not the kind of mistake that can be corrected with an apology or smoothed over with a renegotiated treaty. The kind of mistake that changes the shape of everything that comes after it. The kind that future historians, assuming the Valorian Council still has historians in 20 years, will point to and ask, with genuine bewilderment, why no one saw it coming. I saw it coming. I submitted a threat assessment on human expansion patterns 14 months before Velorith made her decision in the conclave chamber. It was 43 pages long. I used charts. I used historical parallels. I cited 7 other species that had underestimated early-stage civilizations and the consequences that followed in each case. I requested an audience with the Council Inner Circle. I was told that my assessment was noted and that the Council would take it under advisement. They did not take it under advisement. What Velorith did on that day was not policy. It was impulse. She was irritated by the human ambassador's tone, by the directness of his arguments, by the way he looked at the Council not as authorities to be appeased but as parties to a negotiation. In Valorian culture, that kind of directness from a younger species is considered an insult. So she responded the way a Valorian of her rank responds to insults from lesser parties. She eliminated the source of the irritation. I was not in the chamber when it happened. I was in my office, reading signals from our outer network, when my aide came in and told me. I remember the exact words she used and the exact expression on her face when she said them, because both were wrong. She said it the way you report a minor incident, a scheduling conflict, a broken relay. Not the way you report something that is going to rearrange the galaxy. I pulled up the feed from the chamber archive. I watched Jonas Reyes's speech. All of it, from the beginning, not just the moment at the end. I watched him stand at the podium and speak for 17 minutes with the calm, methodical patience of someone who had spent a long time preparing to be heard. I watched Velorith's expression shift as he continued, from boredom to irritation to something that, in a Valorian, signals the end of tolerance. And then I watched the 9 seconds. And I sat back in my chair, and I looked at the ceiling, and I thought, we have just handed humanity something they could never have built on their own. A justification. The first thing humans did surprised me. Not the fleets, I expected fleets. Not the blockade, I had outlined the exact transit points they would target in my assessment, and they had chosen 6 of the 7 I identified. The 7th was a line I had noted as secondary. They were more thorough than even I had projected. What surprised me was the tribunal announcement. 3 weeks into the conflict, Earth broadcast a message to every species in the known galaxy. Not to the Council specifically. To everyone. The message stated that Earth was filing formal charges of unlawful elimination against Adjudicator Prime Velorith and that a tribunal had been organized, to be held in open session, with jurors drawn from species not affiliated with the Council. They did not ask the Council's permission. They simply announced it, the same way they had announced the blockade, as a fact, with the legal citation underneath it. I brought this to Veloritha's attention personally. She laughed. A human tribunal, she said. They are going to sit in a room and read charges against me. Charming. They are going to broadcast it, I said. To every receiving station in the galaxy. And 37 non-aligned species have already agreed to observe. 6 of them have submitted testimony requests. She stopped laughing. Testimony, she said. About what? About their own experiences with Council authority, I said. Velith Prime. The Meridian suppressions. The reclassification of the Ethon homeworld, I paused. Events that our official record describes differently than the beings who live through them. She was quiet for a long moment. This is a political maneuver, she said. They are trying to build a coalition. Yes, I said. They are doing it in public, with documentation, in a format that any species with a receiver can watch in real time. We control the primary broadcast networks. They are not using our networks, I said. They brought their own. This was the part of humans that my report had tried to convey and that the Council had not absorbed. Valorian conflict doctrine was built on the assumption that you controlled the information environment before you moved in any other direction. You held the networks. You shaped the narrative. You controlled what the wider galaxy understood to be happening. Humans had looked at that assumption and built an entirely separate infrastructure. Their broadcast relays had been installed quietly, over years, in what had been classified as civilian communications expansions. Commercial contracts. Nothing military, nothing provocative, nothing that would trigger a Council review. But the cumulative result was a signal network that did not pass through a single Council-administered node. They had not done this in the weeks since the Conclave incident. They had done it over the previous decade. I had noted it in my report. I went back to my desk after meeting with Velorith and opened my files again. I started building a new assessment, not of what humans might do, but of what they had already done and what it revealed about how they thought. The picture that emerged was not of an aggressive species looking for a fight. It was something more patient and, in its own way, more unsettling. Humans had joined the galactic community with their eyes open. They had observed how the Council operated. They had watched what happened to smaller species that drew Veloritha's attention. And they had made a long, quiet decision to be ready. They had not told anyone. They had simply gotten ready. In Valorian doctrine, that kind of preparation is called preparation for conquest. But as I reviewed everything, the commercial infrastructure, the civilian relay networks, the published legal documents dating back years that established human rights under Galactic Code, I began to understand that it was something else. It was preparation for survival. It was the behavior of a species that had looked at the galaxy and decided, without drama or announcement, that they were going to be here in 100 years no matter what anyone else decided. And now someone had given them a reason to stop being quiet about it. The battle for Velketh Station, if you could call it a battle, lasted 40 minutes. Earth's 3rd Expeditionary Fleet surrounded the station and broadcast evacuation windows for every non-Valorian crew member and diplomatic representative aboard. Precise departure times. Designated exit corridors. Guaranteed safe passage for any vessel that left within the window. 12 species evacuated. The windows closed. Then the fleet held position and waited. Valorian Station Command sent a challenge signal. Earth's fleet commander, a woman named Priya Cole, responded by reading Article 12 of the Galactic Transit Code aloud on an open channel. Article 12 outlined the conditions under which a diplomatic installation could be taken under protective custody in the event of a violation of diplomatic law. She cited the relevant clause. She cited the subclause. She cited the precedent from 200 years ago when the Ethon Council had used the same article to seize a Valorian station. Then she held position and waited some more. No Valorian vessel moved. Because here was what I had tried to explain in my report and what Velorith had completely failed to understand. Valorian doctrine assumes that your opponent will escalate. That when you hold a position, they will push against it, and then the confrontation becomes physical and you move into military engagement on your terms. Humans did not escalate. They waited. They were extraordinarily, almost inhuman in their patience, and the waiting was not passive. The waiting was pressure. Every hour that fleet held position was another hour of broadcast time for the tribunal. Another hour of the supply blockade tightening. Another hour of non-aligned species watching Earth follow its own stated rules with perfect consistency while the Council made no coherent response. Velketh Station was taken without a single exchange of fire. Earth landed a small team, secured the communications infrastructure, and converted the station into a broadcast hub for the tribunal proceedings. They put a human flag on the external sensor array and then, in what I am certain was a deliberate choice, they put the Galactic Transit Authority's flag next to it. Not just Earth's flag. The law's flag. I filed my resignation that evening. Not because I had given up. Because I had already accepted what my report had tried to convey and what the Council had refused to hear. We had not made a military error. We had made a fundamental error about the kind of species we were dealing with. We had looked at humans and seen something young and small and manageable. We had seen a species that had not yet learned its place. What we had actually been looking at was a species that had decided, very quietly and very thoroughly, that it did not have a place assigned to it by anyone else. It had a place it was building for itself, and it had been building it for years, and now Velorith had given it every reason to stop building quietly and start building loudly. I packed my files and walked out of the Intelligence Directorate. Outside, in the corridor, 2 of my aides were watching a news broadcast from one of Earth's relay stations. The tribunal was beginning its first open session. I stopped and watched for a moment. Yara Osei was sitting at the presenting table with a recorder in her hand. She looked calm. That was the thing about humans. The thing I had tried to capture in 43 pages and that I had ultimately failed to fully describe. They carried their grief like fuel. They did not let it consume them. They fed it to whatever came next and they kept going. Velorith had eliminated a man she saw as an irritation. She had, in fact, lit a torch and handed it to everyone who knew him. I watched the broadcast for a moment longer. Then I picked up my bag and walked toward the evacuation transports. There was no longer anything useful for me to do here. Part 4, The Trial at the Edge of the Galaxy. I had not planned to speak first. The tribunal had a process. There were 47 representatives from 31 species seated in the observation rings. There were legal advocates from 9 different worlds who had volunteered to assist with documentation and cross-reference. There was a panel of 7 jurors, none of them from Earth, none of them from a council-affiliated species, chosen by a process that took 2 weeks and that I had watched with more anxiety than I had felt at any point since leaving Velketh Station. The process was supposed to begin with an opening statement from the tribunal's lead advocate, a quiet, careful man named Benedict Shaw who had spent 20 years practicing interstellar law and who had the particular talent of making the truth sound inevitable. Instead, when the chamber opened its first session and the broadcast began transmitting to every relay station in human space and to every non-aligned receiver in the galaxy, one of the Valorian defense representatives stood up and said, on open broadcast, that this tribunal had no legal standing, that its proceedings were a manufactured spectacle, and that the so-called victim had provoked the response he received. Benedict looked at me. I walked to the presenting table. I did not have notes. I had the recorder in my hand, the same one that had been clipped to my collar in the conclave chamber. I had carried it every day since. I set it on the table and I said, in the quietest voice I could manage, "May I play something for this tribunal?" The senior juror, a tall, gray-skinned being from the Margolis collective whose name translated roughly as Elder Who Counts, nodded once. I pressed the recording. The chamber filled with Jonas's voice. He spoke for 17 minutes. I had heard it so many times by then that I knew every pause, every breath, every shift in tone. But hearing it in that room, through those speakers, in front of 47 witnesses from 31 species, it was different. It was the first time most of them had heard it. I watched their faces. I watched the way they stilled, one by one, as his words settled into the room. He was not demanding. He was not aggressive. He was asking. Clearly and directly and with every piece of evidence organized and presented in sequence, he was asking for something that should not have required this much justification to receive. The recording ended. 9 seconds of silence. And then the 9 seconds that followed. I had heard that part 100 times too. It had not gotten easier. I did not let it show, because I had promised myself that I would not let it show in that room, not because I was ashamed of how much it hurt but because Jonas had been careful and measured and honest, and the least I could do for him was be the same. When it was finished, I turned off the recorder. "That was Ambassador Jonas Reyes," I said. "Citizen of Earth. Diplomat. The person who wrote the framework document that this tribunal will be using as part of its legal basis, because he had been working on it for 3 years and because it is, objectively, the clearest articulation of equitable galactic governance that has been produced in the last century. He was eliminated in the chamber of the Grand Conclave of the Galactic Council, without charge, without trial, without warning, by Adjudicator Prime Velorith of the Valorian Authority. I was standing 6 meters away. I have recorded testimony from 4 other beings who were present. I have the station's own sensor logs, which were subpoenaed under Article 22 of Galactic Discovery Law. And I have, sitting in this chamber today, 3 individuals who have come forward to testify about previous incidents of the same nature." I picked up the recorder. "The defense has suggested that Ambassador Reyes provoked his response. I invite the tribunal to examine the 17 minutes you just heard and identify the provocation. I have reviewed it many times. I cannot find it." I sat down. Benedict looked at me with an expression that was not quite a smile but was in the neighborhood of one. He leaned over and said, very quietly, "You were not supposed to go first." "I know," I said. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," he said. "That was the right call." The testimony began. The 3 individuals who came forward were not, as the council had assumed, coached by Earth. They had reached out to us. All 3 had seen the broadcast announcement of the tribunal on Earth's relay network and had contacted Benedict's office independently. All 3 represented species that had experienced direct council authority action. All 3 had events in their history that the council's official records described as administrative corrections or security enforcement measures. What the 3 witnesses described was not correction. Was not enforcement. It was the same thing I had watched happen to Jonas, applied to different people in different rooms over the previous 200 years, with the same absence of process and the same expectation that the matter would simply be absorbed and forgotten. The chamber was completely silent during each testimony. Not the polite silence of an audience managing its reaction. Genuine, struck silence. The silence of people who were hearing something they had suspected and had never had confirmed, something that explained old griefs and unresolved questions and the particular ambient unease that had been part of life under council authority for so long that most species had stopped noticing it. Velorith was present on the 2nd day. She had not wanted to come. The council's legal team had advised against it. She had come anyway, because she was Velorith and she had spent her entire career believing that her presence in a room changed the balance of that room. She sat in the respondents section with 4 legal advocates around her and watched the proceedings with the careful, controlled expression of someone who had decided in advance that nothing in this room was going to touch her. Benedict began her examination with small questions. Administrative questions. Procedural questions. Questions about council protocol for handling diplomatic disputes, about the chain of authority in the conclave chamber, about the regulations governing the use of enforcement technology by council members in session. She answered them all cleanly. She was very good. I had expected her to be. Then he asked her what specific protocol she had followed before discharging her gauntlet in the conclave chamber. She said that the Adjudicator Prime has discretionary authority to manage the conduct of proceedings. He asked her which regulation codified that authority. She cited one. He produced the regulation on the tribunal's main display. He read it aloud. He asked her to show him the clause that permitted discharge of enforcement technology against a diplomatic representative during a formal address. The room waited. She said that the regulation was interpreted broadly. He asked who had the authority to interpret it. She said the Adjudicator Prime. He asked whether the Adjudicator Prime's interpretation of her own authority was subject to any review process. She said that council internal review covered such matters. He asked when that review had last resulted in a ruling against a sitting Adjudicator Prime. She did not answer immediately. He waited. The silence stretched for 11 seconds. I counted. Then she said that council records were not available for external review. Benedict said that he had subpoenaed those records under Article 22, and that they were available, and that in fact he had reviewed them, and that in 217 years of council records there was not a single internal review ruling against a sitting Adjudicator Prime, and he would like to enter those records into evidence. Velorith looked at him. She had the same expression she had worn when she turned away from Jonas's body. The expression that said this does not matter. That said I am not touched by this. That said I have sat in rooms for a very long time and nothing in any room has ever been able to reach me. But the cameras were on her. Every receiver in the galaxy was watching. And the expression that read as confidence in the conclave chamber read as something else entirely on broadcast. It read as someone who had been asked a straightforward question and had no answer for it, and knew she had no answer, and had decided that her only remaining tool was to project authority that no longer had any actual weight behind it. I watched 31 species watch her face. I thought about Jonas's margins. The small, cramped handwriting. Every voice that has known silence deserves to be heard. It was 2 more days of testimony. It was witness accounts and censor logs and cross-referenced historical documentation and Benedict's careful, meticulous construction of an argument that did not rely on emotion or outrage but on the simple, patient accumulation of fact. It was exhausting and it was necessary, and at the end of it, the 7 jurors withdrew. They returned in 4 hours. The senior juror, Elder Who Counts, read the verdict in the Margolis collective's own language, and then the translator rendered it into the 43 languages of the species present. Velorith was found guilty of unlawful elimination without process. The Council's authority structure was reviewed by a secondary motion submitted by 6-member species, and the vote on dissolution of the existing Council governance framework passed with 31 votes in favor and 3 abstentions. Earth had not submitted that motion. We had not needed to. Velorith stood when the verdict was read. She looked at the 7 jurors. She looked at the observation rings. She looked, finally, at me. She did not say anything. I did not say anything either. There was nothing left to say in that room that Jonas had not already said 17 minutes, 6 meters, and a lifetime ago. I picked up the recorder and put it in my pocket and walked out of the chamber into the corridor, where Benedict was standing with his jacket folded over one arm and a look of careful, quiet satisfaction on his face. It held, he said. It held, I agreed. He nodded. What now? I looked down the corridor, at the viewport at the far end, at the stars visible through it in their cold, indifferent arrangement across the dark. Now, I said, we build something better. Part 5, What We Leave in Our Wake. 2 years is not a long time. I know how that sounds. 2 years is 630 days. It is 2 full rotations of Earth around its sun. It is the length of a long university program, or a difficult marriage, or the time it takes for a child to go from not being able to read to reading everything in front of them. 2 years is not nothing. But in galactic terms, 2 years is a breath. It is the space between one sentence and the next. It is the pause before the response arrives. And yet, 2 years after the tribunal, I was sitting in the new Galactic Assembly's main chamber, which was not on Velketh Station, which had been returned to its previous administrative role, but on a newly constructed structure in neutral space, designed by 17 species and built by 22 and paid for by 31, with no single species having more than equal representation in any element of it, and I was watching the Assembly take its 100th vote. The motion was simple. 3 paragraphs. The kind of motion that should not have required 100 previous votes to build the consensus necessary for its passage, but that is how these things work when you are trying to do them correctly. You build the foundation before you pour the floor. You get each piece right before you move to the next. Jonas had understood that. I had watched him understand it, sitting across from me on long transit journeys, going over his notes with that small, focused frown he wore when something was not yet quite right. The motion read, in 43 languages simultaneously, that the unlawful elimination of any sapient being, regardless of their species, origin, or diplomatic status, by any governing authority or its representatives, constituted a violation of galactic standing law, and that any authority found responsible would be subject to review, consequence, and remedy by the Assembly as a whole. It was Jonas's words. Almost exactly. I had read his draft. Benedict had read his draft. We had worked with legal experts from 9 species to translate the intent into language that held up under galactic code. But the core of it, the structure of the argument, the moral premise, the specific protections outlined in each clause, that was Jonas. The vote passed with 41 in favor and 2 abstentions. I sat in my observer's seat and did not clap, because that is not what you do in the assembly chamber, and I did not stand, because the moment did not call for performance. I just sat and felt the weight of it settle somewhere inside me, in the place where I had been carrying the 9 seconds for 2 years. It did not go away. That weight. I am not sure it ever does. But it shifted. It became something I could carry differently. After the session, I walked the long corridor that connected the main chamber to the outer observation ring. The corridor's viewport ran the full length of the wall, and through it you could see the construction platforms where the assembly's secondary buildings were still being completed, and beyond them the dark, and beyond the dark the stars arranged in their ancient patterns, indifferent to everything we were doing down here in our small, lit spaces. A voice behind me said, "Excuse me." I turned. She was young. Valorian, by her features, with the pale violet skin and the 4-line arrangement of eyes. She was wearing the gray uniform of a junior assembly aide, which meant she had passed the vetting process that the assembly had established, a process Earth had specifically not designed, because we had understood from the beginning that the assembly could not be an Earth project. It had to be everyone's project, including species that had been on the wrong side of things and were now trying to be on the right side. "You are Yara Osei," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," I said. "I watched the tribunal," she said. "The whole broadcast. All 4 days." She paused. "I was 16. My teacher made us watch it for school." It was, she stopped and seemed to be choosing her words with a care that reminded me, unexpectedly and sharply, of Jonas. I had questions afterward that I did not know how to ask. "What kind of questions?" "About why Earth stopped," she said. "When you had the advantage. When the fleet was positioned and the blockade was holding and the council was fragmenting." She looked at me directly, with the steady, frank curiosity that young people have before they learn to hide it. "In our history, when a species has the advantage, they use it to take. To secure. To make certain that the advantage becomes permanent. Your fleets withdrew. Your blockades dissolved. You took nothing." I looked at her for a moment. "We took something," I said. "What?" "The record," I said. "The record of what happened. The footage of Jonas's speech. The testimony from the 3 witnesses. The sensor logs. The full documentation of how the council had operated for 200 years. We took all of that, and we put it in front of 31 species and let them decide what it meant." I paused. "That is not nothing. That is, actually, everything." She thought about that. "But you could have taken territory," she said. "Resources. Council infrastructure." "We could have," I agreed. "And then we would have been running an empire, and we would have been the thing that some other species was quietly building their defense networks against for the next 40 years. And eventually someone would have found a justification, just like Valorith found a justification, and it would start again." I looked out the viewport at the construction platforms, at the half-finished secondary buildings, at the crews from 17 species working alongside each other in the cold. Jonas wrote, in his first draft of the charter, that a galactic order built on fear is a galactic order that is always one incident away from collapse. He was right. They almost always are. We wanted something that could stand on its own without anyone holding a weapon over it. She was quiet for a while. We both looked out the viewport. "Was it worth it?" she said finally. "Losing him?" I had been asked that question before. In different forms, with different intentions behind it. Some people asked it as a challenge. Some asked it as comfort-seeking, wanting me to say yes so that they could feel the loss had meaning. Some asked it to make a political point about the cost of conflict. She asked it the way you ask something when you genuinely want to know the answer and you understand that the answer might be hard. "No," I said. Losing him was not worth it. Losing him was a catastrophic, senseless, unnecessary waste of a brilliant person who had 20 more years of good work in him and who deserved to deliver that speech and hear a real response to it and go home and revise his notes and sleep and wake up and do it all again the next day. I paused. It was not worth it. It will never be worth it. The assembly existing does not make it worth it, and the vote today does not make it worth it, and nothing that comes after will ever make it worth it. She looked at me. "But," I said. But Jonas always said, he said this to me more than once, in more than one transit corridor, usually late in the evening when he was tired and being more honest than diplomats usually are, he said that the question of worth is the wrong question. He said that worth is the calculation you make before, to decide whether to try. But once something has already happened, once someone has already been taken, the question becomes different. The question becomes, what are you going to do with the fact of it? What are you going to build in the space where they were? What are you going to carry forward? I looked at the viewport again. He would have hated the idea of being a martyr. He would have hated everything we built being named for him or centered on him. He wanted the work to stand on its own. So we tried to let it. She nodded slowly. Then she said, the motion that passed today. I read the original charter draft. The one from his files that Dr. Shaw released into the public record. Yes. The motion is almost exactly what he wrote, she said. Almost, I agreed. We adjusted 3 clauses for jurisdictional clarity and updated one reference to account for species that joined the assembly after the charter was written. But the argument is his. The structure is his. The moral center of it is his. I paused. He wrote it in his room on the transit vessel 11 years before today. He had no idea if anyone would ever read it. He just thought it was the right way to think about things, and he wrote it down because that is what he did. She was quiet again. Then she said, thank you. For what? For answering, she said. People usually don't, when I ask that question. They give me a speech about sacrifice and meaning. You answered. She walked back down the corridor toward the chamber. I watched her go. Then I turned back to the viewport and stood there for a while. Earth had sent another 6 vessels to the outer arm in the past month. Not fleet vessels. Survey ships, genuine ones this time, carrying scientists and cartographers and linguists and cultural researchers, people whose job it was to learn things and share them. We were also, quietly, still maintaining our defensive infrastructure, because we were human and we had learned enough galactic history to know that good intentions required good support systems. Both things were true. The galaxy was better than it had been, and it was not yet safe enough to stop paying attention. I had been asked, in several interviews and several formal addresses over the past 2 years, whether Earth was satisfied. Whether we considered the matter settled. Whether we would move forward now in a spirit of reconciliation and shared purpose. I had given the diplomatic answer each time, because the diplomatic answer was true. Yes, we were committed to building the assembly. Yes, we believed in the process. Yes, we understood that the Valorian people were not Velorith, that a government's actions and a species' character are not the same thing, and that the young woman in gray who had just asked me a real question was as much a part of the future as anyone. But the honest answer, the one I gave in my own head, was more complicated. Earth was not satisfied in the way that means finished and done and ready to move on. We were satisfied in the way that means we did what we came to do and it held and now there is more work. We were satisfied the way Jonas would have been satisfied, which is to say, looking at what existed now compared to what existed before, acknowledging that it was better, and immediately starting to think about what needed to happen next. He had 20 more years of work in him. We would try to do 20 years of work for him. I put my hand on the viewport glass. It was cold, the way windows always are in space, no matter how much insulation surrounds them. The cold came through. Outside, in the dark between the construction platforms and the stars, a small transport was moving through the assembly's approach lanes. It was carrying, according to the public manifest, a delegation of 3 species who had previously been outside the assembly process and who had requested observer status for the next session. 3 more. Working their way in from the outside, drawn by the recording of something that had been built in open view and tested in the hardest possible way and had, against reasonable expectation, held. They had seen the broadcast. They had made their own decisions about what it meant. That was the point. That had always been the point. I watched the transport move through the approach lanes until it disappeared into the docking section. Then I took my hand off the glass and walked back toward the main corridor, where Benedict was almost certainly waiting with a briefing folder and a scheduling update and 3 questions that needed answers before the next session. On the wall at the entrance to the main chamber, they had installed a plaque 2 weeks after the assembly's first session. I passed it every time I came through this corridor. I had gotten used to seeing it, the way you get used to things that become part of your daily movement, but I always paused for a moment. It was a simple plaque. Gray stone, letters cut into it, 43 language translations arranged in concentric rings around the center. In the center, in English, because that was the language of the men whose words they were. Every voice that has known silence deserves to be heard. Jonas Reyes. 2031 to 2089. I paused. 2 years. Not a long time. Not in galactic terms. But Jonas had believed that things could be made better, and that belief had survived everything Velorith had tried to do to it, and here it was, cut into stone at the entrance to something real. I was not a diplomat by nature. I was a cultural attaché who had ended up in the middle of something enormous and had done the only thing I knew how to do, which was keep a record and tell the truth. I did not have Jonas's gift for the long view or Benedict's gift for the patient argument or Admiral Mercer's gift for the cold, precise management of an impossible situation. I had a recorder and a clear memory and, apparently, a willingness to walk toward things when my better judgment suggested I should stop. It had been enough. I touched the edge of the plaque once, not the letters, just the frame, the gray stone border, and then I kept walking toward Benedict and the briefing folder and the next session and everything that still needed to be done. The stars through the corridor viewport were exactly where they had always been. Cold and distant and indifferent and beautiful. We were building something in front of them anyway. Jonas would have liked that. I was certain of it.